religious liberty and how important it is to your heart, and what we can do to promote religious liberty, not only for our own believers, but for those of other faiths and even those that have no faith. So Lord, as we share this afternoon, give us insight as to what is happening in our world with regards to threats to our religious freedom. We know the closer we get to your coming, the more intense these threats will become. So help us to be vigilant and alert, I pray. Give us open minds. I know it's a Sabbath afternoon. We just have had a wonderful meal. Help us to think clearly. Bless us with your presence, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Yo no sé inglés, hermano, hable español.
So if you will turn to the little narrow thing that you're getting, we talked about Gnarley. It's an acronym that most people have never heard about. It's like a strange word. Gnarley is an acronym for the North American Religious Liberty Association. It's a branch of the Religious Liberty Department of the North American Division. Melissa Reed, who was there last night at the Kansas Avenue Church, we had our first meeting over there, and tomorrow we're going to have 2 breakout sessions, one over at the La Sierra Spanish Church for our Spanish-speaking members. It's called Know Your Rights, and it's going to deal with their immigration rights. And then at the Glendale Academy tomorrow from 10 to 1, there's going to be another session on how to get involved in your community and what you can do to develop these relationships with city officials. So under the first question, what is Gnarley? You'll notice it says on line 2, it's a grassroots organization to promote religious liberty of conscience, freedom, and fundamental human rights. I've had the privilege of being able to lobby not only in Sacramento, but in many state capitals and even Congress on religious liberty rights, and to educate decision makers on the importance of certain legislation. So many churches have created a Gnarley group. You can read what that is. They get together and they discuss current events. Some even decide to read a book. They have a book club. There used to be in this area a pastor, and he's living up in Big Bear now. Some of you may know him, Norman Farley. He was on our board. Oh, he married you? Yeah. He was on our board for many years, and so at La Sierra, he developed a book club where people get together once a month and read a book that has to do with religious freedom. That's another thing. And once a year, we didn't do it this year, but usually in the spring, we have a capital day where we invite lay people to come and join with those of us that have done lobbying, and we go around and visit the legislators on a couple of bills, and that's always a lot of fun. And then you have some suggestions what a Gnarley group can do. And there is a website for our Pacific Union, www.churchstate.org. If you go to that website, you can get a lot of updates on what is happening here in the Pacific Union with regards to various bills and legislation. The other is just more of an explanation. See if I can get a copy. I left my copy in the car. Most of you are familiar with ADRA. And you know this world has a severe refugee crisis. And our government, unfortunately, has cut back on the number of refugees ever since the Reagan years. If you turn to the back page, ADRA is encouraging a letter writing campaign. I'm going to tell you in just a minute how you can do that, make it very, very easy. It gives some statistics and how refugees have been cut back. And then if you go to the third paragraph, line 2, it says Canada's ratio of refugees to general population is 498% higher than the United States. And then it gives a number of refugees that came here in the last year. It's less than 0.02% of our total population. And then in the next paragraph, refugees, it says people are not a liability to society, they are a resource. Steve Jobs, founder of the most valuable company in the world, Apple, was the son of a Syrian immigrant. I didn't know that, did you? Similarly, from Albert Einstein through to Spacey Brin, who's the founder of Google, refugees have made profound contributions to America. This next one is something that you need to hear in light of today's political climate. While security must be of foremost concern, since changes to the U.S. refugee processing procedures in 1980, there has not been, notice in bold, a single fatal terrorist act carried out by a refugee. You need to really be aware of that. Jesus, talking of the Last Judgment, says, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. The United States cannot open its doors to everyone in need, but we can go back to the level of hospitality we showed during the 1980s. It is a small step in doing our part in a very troubled world. So if you turn back to the front side, if you go to that web address, I haven't had a time to do that because I just got this paper last night and I don't have my computer with me, but I believe there's a place for you to sign your name, and I think there's a letter already written. But if not, you can use some of the ideas on the back of this to write your own letter. But we're wanting to encourage the United States government to allow, many of the refugees are religious refugees that are being persecuted for their faith. And so we need to act in behalf of our brothers and sisters who are suffering. And so this is one way that you can get involved and do something positive. So now let me begin by, most of the rest of this, you'll just have to listen or write notes. I don't have handouts on what I'm going to share with you now. Kind of a legislative update, but I do have one other handout you'll get in just a minute, about bills that negatively affect religious liberty here in California. Many of you have already talked to me, and I'm really proud of this congregation. Many of you are much farther ahead than most of our Adventist congregations about knowing what's going on. That's something to commend Pastor Lundgren for. A bill, many of you have been asking me about AB 2943, and I want to clear up what that is all about. On April 19, just a little over a week ago, the California Assembly, by a vote of 50 to 18, approved a bill that would ban books, conferences, and counseling advocating Christian, Jewish, and Muslim views on gender and sexual orientation. Now, existing law, which was a bad law that was passed a few years ago, prohibits mental health providers and therapists, counselors from performing sexual orientation change efforts, which are commonly known as reparative or conversion therapy, with a patient that is under 18 years of age, because they say that, those counselors can create undue influence and pressure on them, and these kids, younger kids, can't handle this, and they have a great guilt complex, and many of them take their lives and so forth. But this new bill, AB 2943, applies, and you can go on, I'll tell you a website, if you ever want to look up at bills in California, go to ca.gov. That's california.gov, wwca.gov, and you can look, and then there'll be a place to type in the number of the bill. The bills in the Assembly are always preceded by AB, which means Assembly bill, and then you put in the number, and then the Senate is SB, Senate bill, and then the number. And you can look up not only the history of the bill, what the status of the bill is. You can actually print out, which I did on that bill, and I'll refer to it in a minute. I've got a copy of this bill that I'm referring to, AB 2943. What it would do is now apply these same prohibitions against those that are 18 years and older. Now, when you stop and think that those who are 18 years and older, they can buy cigarettes, they can buy alcohol, they can vote, they can serve in the military, And yet, their freedom to choose and to listen to other views and to seek the help that they want as an adult is being prohibited. People are not allowed to, I'll tell you what they're not allowed to do in just a minute. But it comes under a Consumer Legal Remedies Act, which the main thing is it's saying anything that has to do with a monetary exchange, like the sale of books that advocate purity in marriage, or if a Christian pastor speaks at a conference about sexual purity, anything that involves a monetary transaction, even selling books from a Christian bookstore that advocate the Christian view of marriage and relationships that should exist between men and women, that would be a violation of this bill. Alliance Defending Freedom, which is one of many, many different religious liberty organizations, make this observation about the bill. A licensed counselor could not help a married mother of 3 who is experiencing unwanted attraction to a close female friend or confusion over her gender identity. That would not be allowed for her to get counseling. A religious ministry could not hold a conference on maintaining sexual purity if the conference encourages attendees to avoid homosexual behavior. A bookstore, including online bookstores like Amazon, could not sell many recently published books challenging gender identity ideology and advocating that these beliefs should be rejected by society. And a pastor paid to speak at an event addressing current social topics could not encourage attendees that they could prevail over same-sex desires or feelings that they were born the wrong sex. In the copy of the bill, which I downloaded, they make this observation. It's a flawed observation. You'll see why. It says, the legislature finds and declares the following. Contemporary science recognizes that being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender is part of the natural spectrum of human identity and is not a disease, disorder, or illness. And then they quote from several secular organizations like the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and they're basically saying that this is a natural thing people are born with, they can't change. I was just talking to somebody during the lunch. I personally know and have worked with 3 people who were practicing homosexuals. They didn't just have inclinations toward that, but they were engaged in homosexual activity who have changed and gone straight. And then just this week, in my church up in Fresno, a lady that I baptized, but I didn't know this background because she hadn't shared it before. I just baptized her less than a year ago. She said she had been a lesbian for 15 years, and now God has given her the victory. And I tell people that come to me and, say, I can't change, this is just the way I am. I said, you mean to tell me that the God that I serve, he can give a drug addict victory over their drug addictions, he can give an alcoholic or somebody that's addicted to pornography or any other bad habit, God can give them the victory, but he can't help you? I said, my God is bigger than that. He can help anybody if you just seek him. So, we have to love homosexuals. We don't want to take the tactics that some people do and just talk down to them and criticize them, and like some of the right-wing Christian organizations. But people can change with God's help. I mean, just look at the people that Jesus changed that was referred to. The tax collector, Matthew, and many of the different rogues gallery of people in the Bible. Real characters, and God changed them, and God can change us. So one of the false things that you've heard about the AB 2943 is that people could not, pastors could not give people a Bible because the Bible talks about, pure life. That's not true. That's an overstatement. But anything that has to do with counseling that involves a monetary thing, whether the person pays to go to a conference or they buy a book or they pay the speaker, that would be prohibited under a consumer thing. So, yes, question. Well, that's my understanding at this point, but I'm sure, I'm going to make more comment of this a little later, how the homosexual lobby is the tail that's wagging the dog in most of the bills that are being done on the state level and also on a national level. And unfortunately, I'm going to share a quotation in a minute that sexual rights are trumping religious freedom rights. That's a big battle that we're fighting today. So even though, see, this is a new bill, and it hasn't passed yet. I'm going to give you the status, but I'm sure at some point what you mentioned, they're going to come down on that too. I remember Prop 8, you remember several years ago, Yes on Marriage. I was involved with a group of pastors up in the Bay Area on that. And several of the liberal denominations like the United Church of Christ and United Methodist took out an ad in the paper and said, we support gay marriage. But there was others of us from a conservative Christian background that took out an ad that says, we love gays too, but the Bible does not condone this practice, or something like that. I forget the wording. And there was not only churches, but businesses that took out that ad, and those that took out an ad in favor of traditional marriage, their businesses were not only boycotted, but broken into, and damage was done to them. It was rooting to their business, and they wrote, terrible things on the windows of their business, you a homophobia people, and just terrible. They talk about toleration, but my experience has been that they're the least tolerant people in the world. It's supposed to be a two-way street, but in their mind, it's my way or no way, So anyway, that's where the battle is being fought today. Let me give you the status of where that is right now. It passed the Assembly, as I said, by a vote of 50 to 18. It now goes to a Senate committee. Let me give you a little background on how bills go through the legislature. First of all, a legislator introduces a bill. It's assigned to committee by somebody that like if it has to do with finances, it goes to Appropriations Committee. If it has to do with health, it goes to the Health Committee and so forth. It goes to committee, and when a bill is in a committee, citizens like you and I can go and speak to that committee. You have to put your name on a clipboard and say you're speaking in favor or against the bill, and they'll invite you to speak. That's where our greatest success is in defeating a bill. I could tell you stories of many bills that I've defeated in committee just by speaking there. Then when a bill is heard in committee, they have several options. They can either pass it on to the floor of their respective house. So if the bill starts in the assembly and it's in assembly committee and they vote to pass it on, then it'll go to the floor of the assembly where they can vote on it. The committee can also kill a bill, or they can table a bill. We're always glad when they kill a bad bill, and it just stops right there. It doesn't go any further. But okay, in this particular bill, it went through Assembly Committee, it went to the floor of the Assembly, it was passed, and now it's going to cross over, it's going to go to a Senate Committee. And there will still be the opportunities to speak to committee or write letters to the people that are on that committee. If you go to the website, you can find out the California.gov website, who's on that committee. It hasn't been assigned to committee yet that I know of on the Senate side. Then they can either approve it or kill it, or they can add amendments to the Assembly bill. Now, if they add amendments to the Assembly bill, it's got to go back to the Assembly, and they've got to approve the Senate amendments. It goes back and forth. And then eventually it goes to the floor of the last house, like in this case the Senate. And if the Senate passes it, then it goes to Governor Brown for his signature. So there's still a chance for us to defeat this bill. It's not a bill yet. It's passed the House, but it's going to the Senate, and we're trying to get enough momentum for the grassroots for people to speak up. And the simplest thing, you don't have to be educated on this bill. Just find out who your senator is for your area where you live here in the Riverside area in the telephone book, and just call their office, and all you have to say, I'm calling about AB 2943. I'm opposed to it, and I would encourage your assembly member or senator to vote no against this bill. Anybody can do that. You don't have to give all the reasons. You don't have to be an expert lawyer or give all these reasons for or against. Just call them and saying you're a citizen, you're concerned about this bill. You are a constituent of theirs in their community. He is your senator or representative, and you want your representative or senator to know that please tell your senator or assemblyman to vote no on this particular bill. So if you do that, that would be a great help. So any questions on that before we move on to some other things about California? Well, very good. There was a bill, before I pass out the next paper, Senate Bill 219, which was passed by Governor Brown last year in October, which is pushing another LGBTQ rights having to do with long-term care facilities. Some of you may remember this one, another terrible bill. This bill would inflict civil penalties on any skilled or residential care facility and their staff if patients identifying as transgender aren't referred to by their preferred name. Now, the gender pronoun that could be used, I understand there's up to 50 different options by which they could be called. Who in the world knows all of those different options? If you use a wrong pronoun in describing to him, she, or it, or they, or whatever, you could be prosecuted. But it goes further than that. The bill mandates that gender be determined by self-identification, not biology. As a result, anyone claiming to be a woman or a man would have to be treated like their preferred sex in regards to rooming situations and bathroom usage. There are no exemptions for religious organizations that run these facilities. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want my mother or grandmother rooming with a male who's using, not only staying in the same bedroom, but using the same bathroom and shower. I mean, how ridiculous are some of these legislators? I mean, you know, as Billy Graham said several years ago, and he would roll over in his grave right now, he said, if God doesn't come pretty soon, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. Things have gotten just so terrible, so perverse. You know, it's like the days before the flood. There was only God saw only wickedness and evil continually. So unfortunately, California is noted for these very liberal, anti-moral positions. All right, at this point, these are for old people, and we're subjecting our senior citizens primarily who are in these long-term care facilities to this kind of abuse. Just ridiculous. Now, what you're receiving here is a legislative alert from Alan Reinick and our Religious Liberty Department here in the Union. I want to take time to go over this with you. We need your help, and I'll show you on the back page of this how you can help on these three particular bills. But let's start with paragraph 2. I know most of us get a lot of papers and we just don't take time to read it, so I'm going to just go over it with you right now. Thank you, gentlemen. Make sure you keep one for yourself. The Me Too revolt, which you've heard, you know, that's really gained momentum, especially now that women are coming out against sexual harassment, and Bill Cosby, if you haven't heard, of course, was found guilty. And then I just heard the other day that Tom Brokaw, was it Tom Brokaw? Another news commentator, the allegations have been made against him. So that's what we mean by the Me Too movement. This revolt against sexual harassment has a positive spin to it. Let's see, it's created several opportunities to strengthen California laws that will not only protect workers from sexual harassment, but from all forms of harassment, discrimination, and retaliation, including Seventh-day Adventists whose Sabbath observance conflicts with work requirements. Let me just interject and say right here that here's a good illustration of Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. Who would think that, a gay rights bill would turn out to favor Seventh-day Adventists with Sabbath work problems? Well, let's see how that's going to fit out. The Church State Council continuing supports these measures, not merely because they offer protection for our own church members, but because we oppose harassment and discrimination generally. Although when we think of harassment, we tend to think sexual harassment, but the Church State Council increasingly encounters claims of harassment due to race or religion that accompany claims of religious discrimination. So here are the bills. It says 3 bills, but there's actually 4. Assembly bill, these are all in Sacramento in California, 1870, which extends the statute of limitations from 1 to 3 years for all harassment, discrimination, and retaliation claims. Often, Adventist church members first learn about the legal services provided by the Church-State Council after it is too late to file their claims. I didn't have time this morning to mention a well-known case on the national level with two Seventh-day Adventist workers at Kellogg's. They're actually working for a subsidiary of Kellogg's, Morning Star Farms, who were fired for their refusal to work on the Sabbath. And that case is now before the 10th Circuit of the United States court system being appealed, and Alan Reinick and some others have filed a brief of the court with them on this issue. They were fired several years ago. Usually these Sabbath cases take years to go through the legal process. And so many Adventists don't know at first, particularly if they're new Adventists, that they have recourse to call the Church-State Council or their local pastor, and we can go to bat for them and help them with their Sabbath work problems. They want to extend this time when you can file a claim from 1 year to 3 years. Let's read the second paragraph, the end of the second line. Over the years, we've had to turn away dozens of church members whose claims are too late, but this bill would enable many more church members to assert their claims when they were fired because of their refusal to work on the Sabbath. So it's basically extending the statute of limitations, which we're certainly in favor of. Then the next bill, Senate Bill 1038, restores personal liability for managers who retaliate against workers for complaining of harassment or discrimination, including those who request religious accommodation for Sabbath observance. I can say from personal knowledge that this is a tactic that many employers use. When you or a pastor tries to tell them, hey, you're in violation of the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and just for bringing the complaint, even if you're kind about it and saying, I have rights, the law says you cannot discriminate on the basis of religion or race or all these other things. And many times just by raising this claim, the boss fires you, and up to this time we've had no recourse. That's retaliation. This bill would address that. Second paragraph, we call this the when a person is not a person bill. That's kind of strange, but let's just follow. California law holds the definition of persons liable for retaliating against those who complain of harassment or discrimination, including those who request religious accommodation. A decade ago, an appellate court held that a person was not a person. That is, that individual supervisors could not be held personally liable for retaliation, only the company at large. But your immediate supervisor could not be held liable. The Church-State Council has been advocating for a reversal for many years, and this bill will hold everybody accountable. If you can prove that you were fired because you made a complaint, there will be legal recourses for you. And then the next one is and on the back page it says, why is this important? Often church members contact us at the first sign of trouble over their need for Sabbath accommodations. This bill would give us a powerful tool to encourage supervisors on the lower level to make a good faith effort to provide Sabbath accommodations. Let me just interject something here. The standard over the years from a bill that was passed probably back in the 80s, Trans World Airlines versus a man by the name of Hardison, he was a Sabbath keeper, not an Adventist, was fired for his refusal to work for the airline on the Sabbath. So this case went to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled on the basis of the Economic Employment Opportunity Commission that an employer must make a reasonable accommodation to accommodate the religious beliefs of a workplace. So over the years, employers have become wise to this expression, reasonable accommodation. They've said, well, I've tried to find somebody to switch with them, or I tried to give them another job or whatever, but I wasn't able to accommodate them, or it's going to cost me a few dollars to make this change. So I made a reasonable accommodation, so they use that as a big loophole to walk through. But fortunately, a new bill was passed in Sacramento a year ago, taking the Americans with Disability Act and using their interpretation of reasonable accommodation. And that's been applied to all the statutes dealing with religious accommodation here in California, not across the nation. California was the first to adopt this good bill, thanks to Alan Reinnick's working on this. Reasonable accommodation is now defined as, the key words are significant cost or time. An employer can't say, I spent 5 minutes trying to accommodate you and I couldn't come up with a solution so bad. They would have to prove in court, if you can test it, that they spent undue amount of time or money trying to accommodate you. And the law says you don't have to find a replacement, somebody to switch with you. It's up to the company to make that provision for you and to find somebody that will swap or give you different hours. So just some heads up on how that works. California AB 2946. This is similar to this other one, retaliation, but this is what is known as a whistleblower law. If you blow the whistle and complain of illegal activity, including violation of the right to a Sabbath accommodation, will not be responsible for attorney's fees when filing claims under the Whistleblowers Protection Act, Labor Code, and you have the number there. Workers who complain to employers of illegal activity are protected as whistleblowers. This includes Adventists who complain about the failure to provide religious accommodation. Many workers, especially low-wage hourly workers, are unable to assert their claims. Why? Because they cannot obtain legal representation. Pursuing legal rights is expensive, as some of you may know. Lawyers often cannot afford to serve low-wage workers without an attorney's fee provision. This bill would enable low-wage workers to obtain legal help to pursue whistleblower claims, including claims that the retaliation was due to asserting their right to Sabbath accommodation. And then you can read about the next bill, which is about childhood sexual assault. Now, what can you do? How can you get involved? At the last paragraph on the page, you can go to www, it's highlighted there, it's churchstate.org, that's the one for our Pacific Union. You can click on the Get Engaged button, and then you can enter your personal data and under Take Action, you will find the bills that the Pacific Union Conference is working on. You click on the bill number, and it will take you to the letters. I just did it yesterday before I left home. The letters are already printed there for you. You just have to click on, where it says click, you've entered your personal data, and it automatically sends a letter to your legislators for you. So how easy is that? So, I'm wanting to let you know, you hear about, we should get involved, but they're very easy and simple things. Calling people and saying I'm for or against a particular bill, clicking on the website, you can all do that. And if we'd all speak up, there's a rule of thumb that for every person who calls or writes, it's equivalent to 100 other people who think the same way you do, but just didn't take time to write. So you represent 100 people, and you get 10 of you to do this, that's 1,000 people. Legislators begin to listen. They just do what they do because nobody speaks up, and so we really need to get involved. Well, so much, there's more we could say about California. There's a lot of homosexual bills that have moral issues that we're not in favor of, but they really don't impact religious liberty, so I'm not going to talk about those this afternoon. But I do want to now broaden the scope to talk about what's happening in America. An organization called First Liberty Institution recently released a report for the last 5 years of all the known religious liberty violations in the United States. The 216 survey, which was the last one to be released, revealed a 15% increase in violations of religious liberty over the previous year and a 133% increase since they started tracking and publishing the survey in 2012. According to the report, hostility towards religious liberty continues to rise in the public arena, as well in the realms of education, religious institutions, and the U.S. military. And here's a key statement. Religious freedom in the U.S. is being pushed more and more towards private expression as secular intolerance tries to eradicate religion from the public square. It used to be that religious liberty issues focus on largely uncontroversial topics such as land use, zoning issues, like if a church or a school wants to build a church or property in a loan that's in a zone that's a place that's zoned for commercial properties, or prisoners' rights, or Sabbath work issues. But now it seems like the battle has focused to the core of the culture wars. There are two strands of this new dimension. On the one hand, there are deep disagreements on the questions of sexual morality, such as abortion, contraception, gay rights, and same-sex marriage. Conservative religious leaders condemn as grave evils these things that I've just mentioned, which many other Americans view as fundamental human rights. But on the other hand, much of the divergence on religious liberty centers on Muslims and on Islamic religion. Specifically, many outspoken advocates of religious liberty find it perfectly consistent to simultaneously deny such protection to Muslims. A recent Cornell study revealed that 44% of Americans favor curtailing the civil rights of Muslim Americans. These include such things as registration for Muslims, monitoring mosques by U.S. law enforcement, undercover infiltration of Muslim organizations, and profiling those with Middle Eastern heritage. I don't know about you, but the things that I've just read, I'm not comfortable with them, especially that last one, profiling people with Middle Eastern heritage. This last Sabbath, my church, we had an international Sabbath, and we have people from several Middle Eastern countries, including Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. And to be targeted just because you come from that country of the world isn't really right. I understand the concerns for security, but to just target people without any, evidence and just say, just assume you're a bad person because you come from that part of the world isn't true. I have many good Muslim friends. In fact, there's a couple that live in San Diego that I knew when I was pastoring down there. We've developed a close relationship with. The strange thing is this Adventist lady that I knew, she married a Muslim after she got divorced. She went online looking for a romantic relationship, and she found a Muslim believer. So she communicated with him for years over the internet, and then she got married to him. I have to say he's a really, really nice guy. And so they've come and spent several days at our house. My wife and her are just like two sisters. And so we've sat down in the evening comparing the Bible and the Quran. I have 3 different versions of the Quran, and I've studied the Muslim religion quite a bit, and we had a very friendly discussion. They've invited us to come down to San Diego and spend some time with them. Muslims are children of God too. It's unfortunate that some of the extremists have hijacked their religion, and given them a bad name. But, everybody deserves the freedom, even if we don't agree with their crazy beliefs, to practice their religion as long as it doesn't harm somebody else. And then the U.S. Civil Rights Commission made this finding. It said, the conflict between religious liberty and non-discrimination principles is profound, and the tension appears most acute when religious liberty and sexual liberty conflict. The commissioner of the organization, the Civil Rights Commission, said, these non-discrimination laws, which are mere statutes, that's the homosexual, rights, can't discriminate against me because of my gender or my practice. They are simply statutes, not constitutional provisions. And he said, these are taking precedent over the Constitution, and this is hostile to religion. There's so much to say, I'm just trying to think of what I should cover, not to cover. Another threat to religious liberty is a growing influence of the white evangelical religious right over President Trump and his administration. The middle of February, I'm going to be doing a taping with Pastor Bohr, Steve Wahlberg, and of White Horse Ministry, and Hal Mayer. Some of you don't know him of Keep the Faith Ministries. We're going to be doing an all-day seminar on religious liberty in the era of President Trump. People were asking me, well, what do you think, since Trump has become president, Do we have more freedoms than we did before? Have good things happened? Yes, a lot of good things have happened. People of faith have been appointed to heads of various departments, but the danger is that the evangelicals are exerting an undue influence on the president. They help to get him elected, and he feels beholden to them to get out the vote. They're counting on him to undermine the separation of church and state, which these evangelicals regard as an impediment to accomplishing their religious goals and making, keyword, making America a Christian nation. People often say, you'll hear David Barton, I forget the organization that he chairs, something, wall builders something, one Alan Reinach calls them myth builders. They try to say that America is a Christian nation. You know, it sounds true, but it's misleading. America was built on Christian Judeo principles, but our founding fathers saw that Christianity was not established as a legal religion of America. So that's kind of a confusion to many people. Many of us are Christian in belief, but America was not legally founded as a Christian nation. And so they're wanting to make America into their version of Christianity. They're also wanting to get, somebody was asking me about this too, Trump to remove the Johnson Amendment to the IRS code that prevents pastors from advocating for or against political candidates. I'm going to say more about the Johnson Amendment in just a couple of minutes. Evangelicals also supported Trump on his nominees for the Supreme Court, such as Neil Gorsuch, who is a conservative that took the place of Antonin Scalia. And as you know, many of the Supreme Court justices are getting quite old, and it's very possible that Trump will be able to nominate 3 more Supreme Court justices, which I think, frankly, could be a good thing for the short term, but in the long term it'll be dangerous. Neil Gorsuch, by the way, was the first Protestant to serve on the Supreme Court right now. Let me give you a little interesting historical background. For over the first 100 years of our history as a nation, there were no Catholics on the Supreme Court. And there were no Jews. In the last several years, the makeup of the Supreme Court, there are now, out of the 9 Supreme Court justices, there are 6 Catholics, and now there's 1 Jew, and I forget what the other one is. It might be a Mormon, I'm not sure what the other one is, and now with Gorsuch is an evangelical Protestant. So, you know, we've had a lot of liberal Supreme Court justices, and they are not supposed to make the law, they're supposed to interpret the law. The legislative bodies are the ones that's supposed to make the law, but unfortunately the Supreme Court has been very active in trying to make law and share their own opinions, what they want to see done. So on the one hand, I'm glad to see that people of faith are being appointed to these high offices, but unfortunately, as we look at Christianity down through the centuries, where has the greatest threat come from? From liberal Christians or conservative Christians? It's usually been on the latter, hasn't it? For those who think that they're on God's side and he's on their side and they have the only right answer, you know, and so in the long term I see this change in the direction of the Supreme Court, and also the evangelical influence on President Trump is going to have long-term negative consequences. Some of religious leaders have recently met with President Trump. They include Jerry Falwell Jr. You remember his father, Jerry Falwell, of the Moral Majority. And so now I'm going to share with you several individuals who are meeting with Trump on a regular basis, these politicians. So we're seeing politicians and religious leaders coming together to push their agenda, which to me is kind of scary. A lady by the name of Paula White, who is a Florida megachurch pastor. Robert Jeffries, who you can hear on the radio, he's the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas. Ronnie Floyd, who was a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and Ralph Reed, formerly of the Christian Coalition and now of the Freedom and Faith Coalition. I get their newsletters because I want to see, what they're saying. They're all part of this Evangelical Advisory Council that has replaced the faith-based office that previous presidents have held, where people of all different faiths, not just Christians, but Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Baha'i and what have you, could meet with the president and share their concerns with regards to religious freedom. But now the pendulum has swung, and there's only a select group of religious people, and it's been narrowed simply to the evangelical people that have a voice with the president. And so now we just have one flavor of Christianity that has been being given special favor with the president. At his recent Road to Majority conference, Ralph Reed, who is seeking to mobilize the Christian voice and influence political decisions, there were a number of high-profile government officials at this religious gathering, including not only President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence, a former Catholic who now says he is an evangelical Christian, but also Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy from California, and Freedom Caucus Chairman Mark Meadows, along with other luminaries like Ted Cruz and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. So much for this idea that the religious right is in a decline. All of these well-known political leaders are coming to these conservative religious conferences and are buying into their agenda. As many as 1,000 conservative evangelical pastors are planning to meet with President Trump in the next few weeks. They're trying to shore up support for the midterm elections the elections this fall. And while these religious leaders and secular leaders are combining to try to accomplish some very good things, there are dangers, as I mentioned, to be considered. I'm certainly in favor of promoting moral values, but many of these evangelicals believe that America must be run on their interpretation of biblical principles. And you see, when religious conservatives gain power, religious laws will inevitably follow, as history has revealed. In Volume 4 of the Spirit of Prophecy, which predated the Conflict of the Ages series, Volume 4 of the Spirit of Prophecy, page 444, we read, "In the last conflict, the Sabbath will be the special point of controversy throughout all Christendom. Secular rulers and religious leaders will unite to enforce the observance of the Sunday." I have a sermon that I preached a couple of years ago on coalitions, conspiracies, and the common good. And we looked at several instances in the Bible where a wide cross-section of individuals got together, like Pilate and Herod, who were enemies of each other. They came together for a common cause to get rid of Christ. And we can look at many other biblical examples and examples in history. And so when these coalitions that include politicians and religious leaders come together to promote an agenda, it's a mixing of church and state, and then we're in for trouble. I referred to the Johnson Amendment just a moment ago, and the reason it's called that, it was introduced by then Senator Lyndon Johnson back in 1954. And the Johnson Amendment amended the Internal Revenue Code to prohibit pastors, religious leaders, and nonprofits from endorsing political candidates or supporting them with their money. During the 2016 election campaign, Donald Trump campaigned on a promise to repeal the Johnson Amendment. Some of you remember that, and some of you thought it was overturned. It was passed by the House, but unfortunately, when Congress passed the recent tax revision laws, the Johnson Amendment was not touched. It was left intact, which is a good thing. But that's not the end of the story. Religious leaders are pushing to remove the Johnson Amendment. The reason being that they want more political power so they can turn America into what they want it to be. The result would be, if the Johnson Amendment were overturned, that the largest and wealthiest churches, political candidates would look to them for endorsement and would respect, what their churches and their members are promoting over the advantage of the poor and the less wealthy churches. The inevitable rights would be that the rights of the minority would be trampled on by the majority rights of the larger Christian groups. Whenever you allow a Christian organization to publicly endorse a candidate or a proposition, it leaves it open for abuse, where the political candidate can use the church to accomplish their goals, and we're just a pawn in their hands. Now, I believe, as a pastor, I'm educating my members all the time about bills before Congress, and I'm encouraging them to write and express their views. Ellen White says we should there's a lot of misunderstanding about, many Adventists think you should not even vote. That's not true. I didn't bring those quotations, but we should become involved. On moral issues, she encouraged people to vote on issues of temperance and things having to do with Sunday closing laws, which we know is the blue laws and things like that. If Christians don't speak up and if Adventists don't speak up, we can't complain if things are passed that go against what we believe. So we should educate our members, but as a pastor, I'm not going to get up and say, well, you should vote for Hillary or you should vote for Trump. That's not my position. But I can tell you what the issues are, and that's a proper place to do in church, so we're informed and can make an intelligent decision. Other areas that need to be addressed by our current administration in Washington, D.C. is religious liberty in the military. Over the past several years, we have witnessed military chaplains who have been disciplined for expressing their faith and religious speech being censored. He should address that liberty in the military be clarified and strengthened, and that appropriate training is given to ensure that religious freedom is allowed by both those who've enlisted and by those who are leading them and their chaplains. Also, our foreign policy has not prioritized religious freedom as it should. It should be integrated into all our foreign policies of the United States at every level. When President Trump or the Secretary of State visit these leaders of other countries and their human rights violations, and Christians have been imprisoned for their faith, it's amazing how our leaders never bring this up with the government leaders. Before they make a deal with them, they should say, you need to release this person that has been falsely imprisoned. Religious freedom is not just an American right, as the United Nations has declared. It is a human right. In fact, the United Nations passed a statement that's called the Declaration of Human Rights. It's much broader than just American rights. That reminds me, as I was sharing earlier with somebody, going back to the conflict between sexual rights and religious liberty rights. I remember when Ben Carson, who's a personal friend of mine, when I pastored in Maryland, he worked at Johns Hopkins, as you remember, Medical Center, and I pastored the Conference Church in middle of Maryland, and his children were students in our local church school, and his wife did a vacation Bible school for us one time, and so he's not a real close friend, but I met and talked with Ben on a number of occasions, and a couple of years ago he came out to California and spoke, and so I was able to visit with him there too. When he was running for presidency, he was interviewed on one of these news programs, and the moderator was trying to push Carson into a corner and saying, now you're a man of faith. You believe in religious freedom, the right to practice your beliefs, don't you? And Carson said yes, and then the moderator said, but what are you going to, don't you believe that the homosexual community has a right to express their freedom? And he was trying to say, basically that their rights override the rights of religious groups. And Carson, not to be boxed into a corner, very aptly said, let me remind you that our Pledge of Allegiance says liberty and justice for who? For all. He said it's not a matter that our rights trump their rights, but everybody's rights should be respected. And I thought that was a great answer that he gave. We don't want to get into this battle of us versus them type of thing. That's a losing battle. As I said this morning, we believe as a church in religious liberty for all people, even those that have a different faith, even those who are opposed to our faith, because that's the way God treats people. So much for that. Are there any questions at this point before I move on to another area? Talk about what's going on in the world about religious liberty. I know I'm just quickly going through these things because I want to just give you an overview, of all these different things. Now let's look about religious liberty in the world. Many of you are familiar what has happened in Russia with the Jehovah's Witness congregations. They have recently been labeled as an extremist group because of their criticism of traditional Christianity in the Orthodox Church, which is one of the prominent religions in Russia. They have favored status with the government, and especially during communism. And then after communism fell, the Orthodox Church kind of took a back seat for a while, but they're regaining their power. And let me tell you, they're every bit as dangerous as was the Communist political party. They don't want any opposition from any other religious groups. They don't want any other religious groups to even practice. They want to have exclusive control over the people when it comes to their religion in Russia. So as a result, with the Orthodox influence on the government, Russia has enacted a nationwide ban on the exercise of their religion of the Jehovah's Witnesses. They have closed down their 2,000 congregations. They have sold off their buildings. In many places, they've destroyed them. Individual Jehovah's Witnesses are at risk of criminal persecution if they engage in any expression of their faith, like handing out the Watchtower or Awake magazines, or just inviting people to go to their kingdom halls. Well, now they don't have any kingdom halls because they've been shut down. Come to a Bible study at their home, they could be in prison for that. The experience of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia is a harbinger of what we can expect, including what's going to happen in Western nations as well, when the freedoms of other minority religion are attacked, and particularly those whose worship and witnessing practices are labeled as extreme. It doesn't take a big stretch to realize that in the time to come, when the mark of the beast issue comes front and foremost, that we're going to be labeled as extreme and fanatics and enemies of law and order. And Ellen White says the worst impressions will be made on our motives, and we'll be considered as enemies of society and of the law. And Ellen White makes an interesting statement in one of the testimonies. She says, the world will see in Seventh-day Adventists a Mordecai in the gate. Very interesting expression. You remember the story in the book of Esther, where Haman hated Mordecai, who was Esther's, was it cousin or uncle? I always get confused. Well, anyway, uncle. And he refused to bow down. Haman tricked King Ahasuerus in getting an order pronounced that everybody should bow down to Haman. And Mordecai, who sat at the gate where the business was conducted in those days in the ancient cities, when Haman would come out, he would not bow down and give him reverence and honor because that's reserved only for God. So Haman was irritated by Mordecai's refusal to worship him, and so he tricked the king in getting a law made that if anybody doesn't worship him, that they should be hung on the gallows. Well, you remember how the story turned out. Esther, through the counsel of her uncle Mordecai and through the wisdom of God, concocted an invitation for Haman to come to dinner with her and the king, and then she exposed Haman's plan to the king. He didn't realize that he had married a Jewish. And then the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, he ended up getting hung on his own gallows. So kind of the old adage, what goes around comes around. So anyway, the world will see, just like Haman saw in Mordecai, we'll see in Seventh-day Adventists this obstacle to what we want to accomplish. So unfortunately, there are worse days ahead. But God will be with his people. People are always concerned about the coming time of trouble. I mentioned my mother this morning, how that used to frighten her as a girl when pastors would preach about all the terrible times, we're going to be persecuted, we don't have the right to buy or sell, we're going to starve and all this stuff. That's not right. We're not going to starve. If you read about, the judgments on the plagues, God, for every judgment that comes upon the wicked, God has a provision for the righteous. When the world is starving for food, God says your bread and water will be sure. And when people are losing their lives, God will send his angels to keep watch over us and protect us. We have nothing to fear as long as we stay close to Christ. It's not going to be an easy time, I'm not telling you that, but God will protect his people and he'll be with them. So that's the only thing that we have to worry about. How God's going to do that, that's his problem, that's not mine. So just trust in God. But there are difficult times that lie ahead. And now, while we still have their freedom, we need to take advantage of every opportunity to preach the gospel, because someday we won't have that. Someday we'll come here Sabbath morning and the doors of the church will be locked and there will be policemen here that says you can't worship here anymore. And then you're going to be on your own. Then what are you going to do? So now's the time, as one of the hymns says, to develop a faith in God that will not shrink, though pressed by many a foe. We need to know what we believe. We need to be studying the Bibles in the spirit of prophecy like we've never studied it before, so we can be prepared and know what's coming upon the world. In France recently, the president issued an executive order that greatly broadens the definition of hate speech or discrimination, particularly against homosexuals and transgenders. This executive order includes non-public comments such as social media, at work, and even at home. In the not-too-distant future, Seventh-day Adventists will be accused of hate speech, of warning the world about the mark of the beast. Anything that is said against a particular group of people, however tactful and however truthful, that goes against popular opinion and beliefs, will be labeled as hate speech. In fact, the homosexuals are always using this terminology today when people disagree with their views. You know, you can disagree agreeably, but they still call you homophobic because you don't agree with them. And going back to what I said earlier about, this Assembly Bill 2643 about not being able to tell homosexuals that they can change. I don't know if I told you earlier, I can't remember. I've personally worked with several people who I've seen change through the power of Christ, and so I know that can happen. I just alluded this morning that in Chiapas, Mexico, which has been known for many years for its violence against non-Catholics, a very heavy Catholic-dominated community, 3 Seventh-day Adventist members' homes were destroyed on March 16 of this year, allegedly because these families would not participate in the celebration of Holy Week. About 50 Roman Catholics, according to news sources, in fact, it was published in the newspaper, it had the headlines that said, "Catholics destroy Adventist homes." That was a local, citywide newspaper. Wow. You know, one religion destroying another religion's homes. And these Adventists had to flee for their lives. They didn't even have time to gather up their belongings. They just had to flee. And they were told by the Catholics in their community if they ever returned back to their town, that they would be persecuted and thrown in jail. So they are still in hiding at this point.
Where was it?
This was in Chiapas, Mexico. So religious persecution and discrimination is alive and well today. And like I said earlier, it's greater than it has ever been, but we very seldom hear any of the things that I'm sharing with you today. There are other things that are going on that I'm just going to mention quickly in passing that will have an impact on religious freedoms in the times to come. And each one of these areas that I'm going to mention now could be a seminar all in themselves. One is the growing influence of the papacy in the Catholic Church. That is going to play a major role in end-time events. As you realize, remember back in 2015, Pope Francis met with President Trump in the White House. He was visited at the airport by President Trump and Vice President Pence and other representatives of government, and they met him at the airport with the flag of the Vatican and the flag of the United States. This is the first time in the history of the United States and of the papacy where our president has gone out personally to visit a pope at the airport to welcome him. Usually the president will stay in the White House and the visiting dignitary will come and meet him at the White House. And then a few days later, Pope Francis addressed a joint session of Congress. And then a few days later, the United Nations in New York. And he is being proclaimed as a moral leader of the world by politicians of all different ills and backgrounds. On several occasions, the Pope has invited the mayors of major cities of the world to the Vatican for symposiums on the issue of climate change. We've heard a lot about that, and somebody was asking me about that today earlier. On April 15, 2015, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, both of them, released a statement titled, Climate Change and the Common Good. A key sentence in this document stated, quote, climate change is a global problem whose solutions depend stepping beyond national affiliations and coming together for the common good. From this statement, we see that the issue is much larger than simply climate change. It's a way for the papacy to exert its influence and power over political leaders. There's a much bigger agenda that's going on that's in mind of the Pope. And then 2 months later, Pope Francis issued an encyclical in Latin called Laudato Si, which means praise be to you, with the subtitle, Our Care for Our Common Home. In this rather long document, which I downloaded and read, is probably about 50 pages, the Pope makes a theological connection between the protection of the environment and Sunday observance. Among the many suggestions he offered for protecting the environment, many of those things are things which we would support, he said, and I quote, as well as giving the planet a Sunday rest will help solve the problem. So he's tying, he's saying the earth needs to rest and people need to rest, and what better day to do that on a common day that most people agree with. So this climate change is being used to push the Sunday agenda. How clever of the Pope. Many people, just looked at this as a scientific issue. It's much deeper than that. There is always a reason for what the church does that's bigger and deeper than what lies on the obvious surface. They have an agenda, underneath their sleeve. The Catholic Church, along with many other religious groups, trade unions, and civic groups from 27 countries in Europe have formed a European Sunday Alliance to pressure the European Union to keep Sunday as a day of rest. The Alliance claims, quote, that a common day of rest is important for families so they can spend time together. One of the buzzwords that you'll hear again and again in Catholic writings is the common good. What does that mean? What's good for most people at large? It means what's good for the majority. That means the rights of the minority don't play into this. The minority, we're going to have to sacrifice what they believe for the result of the common collective good. So that is hardcore Catholic theology, the common good. And you'll hear Pope Francis using this term over and over again. Just be aware of that, what that means. It's not an innocuous term. It's a very dangerous term. Pope Francis also said that spending time with family and friends is an ethical choice for faithful and non-faithful alike, and the special character of Sunday as the Lord's Day should be preserved, even civilly where possible. Many European countries, including Hungary, Germany, and Austria, have Sunday closing laws, and recently under pressure from the dominant Catholic Church, the Polish president, Andrzej Duda, signed into law a bill that largely limits trade on Sunday. Starting on March 1st of this year, shops and markets in Poland will be closed on 2 Sundays every month, and then only 1 Sunday a month will be open for trading next year, and then in 2020, the legislation applies to all Sundays except major holidays. The usual arguments and defense of the seventh-day Sabbath, very interesting now, are being applied to Sunday. There are many religious writers that have written books about the Sabbath and what a great blessing it is, but they're not converted to the idea of the seventh-day Sabbath. They're taking the principle of Sabbath rest, one day in 7 and applying that to Sunday. And the arguments that are using, we need time for family and cohesiveness. In fact, back in the 1960s, I didn't think to bring that with me, there were 2 major Supreme Court decisions that had to deal with very simple Sunday laws. But the Supreme Court ruled that these laws were not religious in nature because they were for the health and welfare of the families and for societies at large. So what's interesting about those Supreme Court rulings back in the 1960s, they've already gotten around the argument that these are not religious laws in violation of the Constitution. They're simply laws for the family, for the working man, and they're health and welfare laws. So all we need, I have another sermon in which I look at 6 or 7 factors that could quickly bring on a Sunday law, like a major economic turndown, like, a crash that made the Depression look like peanuts. If the American dollar were to crash and be replaced by another currency, and all of the monies that you have in savings and stocks and bonds, you can no longer access, believe me, there'd be an uproar from the populace. That could trigger, severe laws. And also a major disasters. These last few years, we've had a lot of significant disasters, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, but, the traditional, what if there's this big earthquake here in California and some of the major cities fall off into the ocean? And the increase in crime and the decline in moral values and all these things, people want solutions, and they say, America is going to pot, and we need to get back to God. God is judging America because of the way we're living. And if we're going to get back to God, the place to start is going back to church. And what better day to do that than on the day that most people have off from work, that most people accept as being the day that they should worship on. So any of these factors and others that I haven't mentioned, they could just trigger a Sunday law almost overnight. Many people think it's going to take a long time for these things to come into play, but the foundation has already been laid, folks. It's not going to take a long time when the right circumstances arise.
Didn't that start in 97?
Pardon me?
Didn't that start in 97?
Did what start?
Start the ball rolling about Sunday?
No, the question was, did this ball start rolling in 1997 with Sunday? No, that's been going on for many, many years, probably since the 60s and 70s. But now, like I say, many countries, there are 3 steps that are taken with respect to Sunday laws. And let me kind of tell you, it's like a 3-legged stool before we get to what we typically call the Sunday law that's referred to in Revelation 13. First of all, there are what we call Sunday closing laws when businesses close down on Sundays. And so that has happened very frequently, and it's happening even in various communities in the United States and various cities. Going back to colonial days, they were called Sunday blue laws when certain businesses were prohibited from being open on Sunday. I often wonder why they were called Sunday blue laws. Can anybody tell me? Not because they made you blue. Because they were written on blue vellum or blue parchment. Interesting, isn't it? I never knew that before. That's why they're called Sunday blue laws. That means that certain things were not allowed to, businesses allowed to be open on Sunday, like the big Walmarts and the superstores. In some communities, the taverns would be open, but you could not buy milk and diapers for the baby. I mean, many of these blue laws had no rhyme or reason to them as to what could be open and what could be sold and what could not. When I pastored in Iowa, I've pastored all over the country, East Coast and Middle America, Southern California, Northern California, Middle California. I've seen a lot over my years. I was on the legislative committee of the Chamber of Commerce in Columbia, Maryland, where I pastored. And CarMax, you've all heard of them, this car dealership, was wanting to open up a dealership in one of the cities in Howard County. And they wanted to open 7 days a week. Well, in this particular county, there were many Christian automobile dealerships. and they closed on Sunday because they wanted their workers, including themselves, to go to church on Sunday. And so they saw this as unfair competition. CarMax is going to be open on Sunday, and we're going to be closed. And so they appealed to our legislative committee to get the businesses in the chamber to vote against CarMax to come into town. Well, I was on that legislative committee for several years, and then I called the religious liberty leaders from our union and from the general conference to come and meet with our legislative committee. And we explained to them that we weren't telling them that they had to be open on Sunday, but it's what we call a free market enterprise, that if other businesses wanted to be open, that was their right to do so. And if I hadn't spoken up and invited these other Adventist representatives to come, they would have passed that Sunday blue law prohibiting automobile dealerships from being open on Sunday. Now, I have no burden on that one way or the other. You know, that's just a minor thing, but that's what we mean by Sunday blue laws. So it starts with closing down businesses on Sunday. The next step is what we call Sunday rest laws. You're not allowed to go shopping, which is an inevitable result of the stores being closed. By the way, the rationale behind the Catholic Church doing this, as you visit the large cathedrals in Europe that will seat thousands of people, you'll find 50 or 75 people in attendance. They're all going to soccer games, which is their religion in Europe and in South America. As you know, soccer is really big. And in Fresno, we have a large Hispanic population, and so a professional soccer team has just come to Fresno. And so in Europe, that is big time. People go to soccer games, they go to shopping. That St. Lucy's Catholic Church that I told you that I preached in, they were right across the street from a big Safeway store. And so as soon as Mass was over, the members would, go across the street to Safeway and do their shopping, and then they'd go out to restaurants and eat. It's because of all those things that the attendance at Mass in Catholic churches in Europe are suffering a declining attendance. And so with the declining attendance, guess what? They're also suffering a decline in monetary gifts that are given to the church. And so the rationale behind closing the businesses on Sunday is really about the almighty dollar and about having more people in attendance at their church so the priests can indoctrinate them in what they want to believe. So you can see how clever, what their motives are behind all of these things. So first of all, there's a Sunday closing law, and then there's a Sunday rest law. And then the third thing that follows that pulls it all together is the Sunday worship laws. The first two have already taken place. The stage has been set. The next stage is where you have to go to church on Sunday, and you can't work on Sunday. By the way, something I hadn't prepared to mention, I wish I had the statements from Ellen White, but back in the 1800s, there were significant Sunday laws that were passed in the South, particularly in Tennessee and Kentucky. And many of our Adventists were imprisoned because they were working on Sunday. And at that time, in a very significant year, 1888, you remember the famous Minneapolis General Conference when A.T. Jones and Wagner brought the message of righteousness by faith to the forefront of the Adventist church. That very year, Congress Senator Blair of Connecticut introduced a bill that would require people to worship on Sunday, and H.E. Jones almost single-handedly defeated that bill in Congress, told him that that was a violation of people's religious freedoms, and that was not the place of the government to tell people when they had and could not worship. So anyway, in light of what happened in the South in the 1880s, Ellen White advised our people that when future Sunday laws come, the big one that we often talk about, that we should not go out of our way to push our rights by working on Sunday. She doesn't say we should go to church on Sunday, but she says, don't do your washing, don't work in your yard, don't mow your lawn. I'm just adding some extra things in today's terminology. Don't paint your fence or do carpentry work. Don't go out of your way to irritate your neighbors. She said, use Sunday to do missionary activity. Go out and do Bible studies with people. Go out and visit the sick and minister to the homeless. Do deeds of charity and good deeds on Sunday. Make that a missionary day, not a worship day, but a missionary day. And I think that's a good balanced counsel that Ellen White has given us. So just remember that in the days to come. We should never flaunt our religion or go out of the way to bring a time of trouble upon us unnecessarily. But it is going to come, and as I said this morning, the reason I'm so passionate about religious liberty, because it creates that environment in which we can preach the gospel so people can make a decision for Christ. And religious liberty can only people can only preach the gospel as long as there's religious freedom. So the two go hand in hand and they complement each other. So I guess that's about all I want to say right now. I thank you for staying by this afternoon and hope this has been helpful to you. Any questions before we close? I'm not sure that I can answer them, but Alan, who's our attorney, is the expert in this area. Question over here. No, mine's on.
Just
There it is.
Yeah, there are certain groups who don't want crosses even in military cemeteries, and they didn't want the cross on Mount Rubidoux. So a certain group bought the land and to keep the cross. Why this is allowed to honor these groups?
There have been many cases, interesting, right here in Southern California, with crosses on public grounds and in military cemeteries. And it's interesting, there was an article in Liberty Magazine some years ago called the title, I'll never forget it, The Battle Over the Cross. People are fighting over the cross. Interesting. Because they say that's the people that are opposed to that are saying it's a violation of church and state. A cross represents a particular religious view, the Christian view, and a cross should not be on public lands because that's a government endorsement of religion. And so what some have done, I forget the other one in Southern California that's been raging for years. I think it's in San Diego. Mount Soledad. Yeah, that's the other one. What finally happened there is a group of private citizens bought the land on which the cross was erected, and they said we have the right because now it's on private property. So, sometimes, especially in military cemeteries, if you've ever gone to these large military cemeteries up near San Francisco, near the Presidio, or in Monterey, or in Europe on these battlefields, you'll see row after row, hundreds and thousands of crosses. And now people are complaining, the atheists and other secular groups, oh, this is a government endorsement of religion. The interesting thing about the cross is that it has dual significance. Not only is it a symbol of Christianity, but it's also a symbol of somebody that has lost their lives. When somebody is killed along the roadside, you'll see people erect a cross, and sometimes they'll put flowers on it, maybe the person's name. It's in honor of somebody who died. And so the cross has kind of a dual meaning and a dual significance. So unfortunately, some people that hate religion, have tried to get governments to remove the cross from public lands. I don't personally agree with that interpretation, but that's the way the courts have ruled, yes.
Yeah, America was founded on Christian principles, and this is what made America. Even if America was founded on Christian principles, these principles give freedom to everybody. But we should not forget that America was founded on Christian principles.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I agree with you, sister. But, when America was founded, it was pretty well just, one flavor of Christianity. But now we have such a mixture in America of religions. Not only, we have a lot of Muslims. In fact, in many cities in America, the Muslim population is larger than the Christian population. And we have other religious groups. I mentioned the Sikhs, who are my neighbors, and many others that are coming into America. So America is very homogeneous right now, and we have such a mixture of different religious groups that people are saying, well, you know, we can't give precedent to Christianity over the other groups. But I agree with you, America has Christian values, and just because across, you know, why can other religions, why can Muslims erect their crescent sign, you know, and they get no complaints about that, but if you erect a Christian sign, you get complaints over that. Well, it just shows you that the enemy is doing everything he can to discredit Christianity.
Here's another question right here.
Pastor, what can you tell us about the gay Seventh-day Adventists over in San Francisco? Is there an acceptance there? How do we stand in that regards, or any other place?
Well, I didn't know there. Well, I know there's an Adventist organization called Gay Seventh-day Adventists. In fact, there was. What was the name of that movie? Seventh Gay Adventists? Yeah, I haven't seen that myself, but I've heard about that. I know there are groups around the country. Then there's even a gay camp meeting. What's it called? Kinship International or something like that. Yes. And then I know some of our churches, and this conference I won't mention, or maybe it's in Southern, actually has leadership in the church that are practicing homosexuals. The church, obviously, these organizations are lay-led. They're not affiliated. They're not endorsed by the Adventist church leadership. But people have a right to you know, form their own groups and do what they want. But unfortunately, they do not reflect, you know, traditional Adventist values and beliefs. Like I said this morning, we should love all peoples because God loves them too. God loves homosexuals. I remember a few years ago, some of these radical religious rights were demonstrating, and they had placards that says, God hates homosexuals and they're faggots and you're all going to burn in hell forever and ever. That's not a way to treat a homosexual. God loves them too, just like he loves us. Amen. So we need to stand for truth and for right and for moral principles, but we need to be kind and Christ-loving as we do that.
Unless we should be accused of promoting error here, Esther was Mordecai's cousin.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Esther looked it up. It's in Esther chapter 2, verse 7. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I was getting confused on it.
You mentioned when the Pope came in 2015, I think you inadvertently said it was Trump that met him. It was actually Obama.
No, it was Obama. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Obama, yeah. And who's the vice president? Biden.
Joe Biden, yes. Thanks for that correction, yeah. My mind was going faster. My mouth was going faster than my mind.
and then I have one question.
Yeah.
It's a tightrope with the ministerial associations, and I've been a president of a ministerial association and involved and stuff. And the thing that I've struggled with was, I know eventually, you mentioned it, long term, it's going to turn bad on us, which is true. But and I may be wrong on this, I want you to help me with this.
Sure.
Are
you compromising your beliefs by joining?
No. Here's what I'm perceiving, that they're almost the only ones that are actively working hard to keep our country decent and honorable with our children's education, as far as the gay rights pushing agenda to teach our kids in the first grade or seventh grade, whatever. It's like I have over the years decided, I'm going to join them in the things I agree with them on, and they're going to know that I disagree with them very heavily on the imposing Sunday sacredness and stuff like that. Do you think that's a healthy way to go, is to team up with them where I can agree with them, but make sure they know that I'm not with them on the Sunday march? Because they're the only ones that are trying to stop this tide of decadence and perversion. And if I don't speak up with them, then I'm just as guilty as the people promoting it.
Exactly.
Is that fair for me to think like that?
Exactly.
In your understanding?
That's what I do. Exactly. Yeah. We need to form partnerships where we can without compromising our beliefs, and also to let them know what we believe and what we stand for if we never associate with them. To give you a good example, Every year in the Catholic Church in January, they have the week or the month of Christian unity. And so as we're eating our lunch, usually the host church would have a discussion question that we'd talk about while we're eating lunch, just kind of a friendly discussion. And so they're going around the circle asking each one of the pastors, what do you think about this ecumenical movement, all the churches coming together, into one big body? Well, that's a hot button issue. So all of these pastors were just giving glowing remarks about how wonderful it is, and they all love to quote John 17, where Jesus said that they all may be one even as we are one. But the kind of unity that, then I'll complete the story, the kind of unity that Jesus was talking about was spiritual unity that was based on biblical teaching, not coming together in one big super church organizational structure and everybody discarding their distinctive beliefs and coming to a common denominator, because when you stop and think about that, if everybody had to sacrifice their distinctive beliefs, what would you have left if everybody has to agree on everything? You'd have such a weak, watered-down religion, there wouldn't be anything of substance. And so everybody's giving this glowing report, and I'm the last one to be asked my opinion. I'm saying, oh, Lord, I really feel that I'm outnumbered here, and I don't know what to say. I don't want to say I agree with that because I have a whole lot of information about the tendencies to the growing ecumenical movement, how the Pope is reaching out, starting with John Paul II, but Pope Francis is really pushing ahead full steam on this, meeting with the Russian Orthodox leader, meeting with Jewish leaders. Last year, I'm going to answer your question in just a minute. Last year was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And the Pope led a week-long celebration in honor of the Reformation. And he's saying, this whole Reformation was just a misunderstanding, and we should all learn to get along with each other, and that was no big deal. And so the Lutherans just recently, I have a whole file folder on what's happening with different religions. The Lutherans are very close to merging with the Catholic Church. They've been working together since the 1960s, ironing out there. If Martin Luther was alive today, he would croak to see, what's happening. And then, who was it? The Waldenses and the Methodist Church united a couple of years ago. The Waldenses are mentioned in the Great Controversy. They were Sabbath keepers, but now, unfortunately, the modern-day Waldenses are Sunday keepers, and they've united with the Methodist Church. And then in England, the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church are closing to unite together. And then there are various Protestant churches that are uniting. In fact, the United Church of Christ was a combination of several Protestant churches that came, same thing with the United Methodist Church. And so Rick Warren, and many of you heard about him at Saddleback Church in Southern California, he is now developing a real close relationship with an Anglican priest, and they are exchanging pulpits and they're sharing with each other. So we're seeing on this ecumenical movement, not only the Catholic Church asking everybody to come back to the mother church, but Protestants are also uniting with other Protestant churches. Now go back to your idea about this ecumenical movement. So now it's my turn to give my answer, what I think about all of this. And I said basically something like, Paul, what you said. I said, I believe it's good where we can get to know one another and we can respect each other's religious beliefs. But I said sacrificing our personal beliefs would not be the right thing to do. And so God helped me out of that predicament. I said we need to work together, on things that we can agree with, and we need to respect each other, but we should not, if you get rid of your distinctive beliefs, then why be a member of that particular denomination if you don't have anything that you stand for? I said everybody loses. If you just say, well, we're going to forget about what makes us a unique denomination, then why even continue that denomination? Anyone else?
At our meetings, pastors used to want to sit next to me for the breakfast so they could have my bacon and sausage. They knew I was
Yes,
gonna eat.
Exactly.
And I said, well, I'll visit you in the hospital when you get trichinosis.
There you go. So that's a good.
And we laughed about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ellen White does say that, just to follow up and then you have a question, that many not only influential leaders in government, but many pastors are going to take their stand for Christ. Amen. You know, and so, and many people, you know, of different religious backgrounds that have gone to Adventist hospitals. Their kids were born in Adventist hospitals. They had an Adventist doctor as their physician, or they had an Adventist neighbor. The seeds have been planted over the years, and there's going to be, even though we know there's going to be apostasy in the church and many people are going to believe, she says there's going to be more that are going to come in and take their place. So right now, what we're doing, we're developing friendships with people on all levels of society, our neighbors, people in government positions, with clergy. Now's the time to reach out, because when the tough times come, they're going to say, oh, you know, I had an Adventist neighbor. They were the nicest people I ever knew. And so this is not fair what's happening to them. I want to find out why they're being persecuted, what it is they believe. So I think the more we can interact with our community, the better off we really are. That's my belief.
Oh, Pastor Gary, you know, in the international level, a lot of radical Islamists are targeting Christians and other Muslims.
Yes, exactly.
But what are you exposed, or what can you share with us about legal things going on in those countries? I mean, it's just kind of every man is a law unto himself, and they're killing whoever they want. But there's a lot of Muslims becoming Christians, right?
Yes, there are.
Do you have any? I know you talk to a lot of people. What are some of the things you're hearing?
Well, you're exactly right. Many of the Muslims don't like all this violence that the radicals, that the terrorists are doing, because it misrepresents their religion. And as they've gotten to know Christian believers, they've noticed that they have a peace and security in their minds that they don't have, and they're longing for that. There's a film that was put out many years ago, an interdenominational film called the Jesus film. Have you ever seen that? That is shown in many of these countries around the world, these non-Christian countries. And these people who have never heard about Christ, when they see Christ on the cross, he's being crucified for no wrong that he's done, people literally just weep and wail out loud. And some people will stand up in the crowd and say, this is wrong, they shouldn't do it, he's an innocent man. And as they show these movies, you know, thousands accept Christ in these non-Christian religious communities. One of my Bible workers up in Campbell, San Jose, grew up as a Muslim in Iraq, and he has quite an interesting conversion story. First, he became a Catholic before he became a Seventh-day Adventist. But he told me one way, we've often wondered, how is God, you know, a question always comes up, going to bring Muslims into the fold? Well, into the Adventist fold, and first of all, into the ecumenical fold with the Catholic Church. Let me talk about the Catholic Church and how Muslims are, and then how they're being won into the Adventist Church. As you know, Catholics venerate the Virgin Mary almost more than they do Jesus Christ, sad to say. You look at the Madonnas, and you've got this statue of Mary, and you got the little Jesus and everything. You see the pictures, Jesus just very miniature, and you got this big overshadowing Mary over there. And most Catholics pray to Mary in the rosary rather than to Jesus. I'm not saying this disparagingly. I have many good Catholic friends, and I've baptized more Catholics than any other people. I love Catholics because they make good Seventh-day Adventists. Why? Much more than Protestants, because Protestants, like a hardcore Baptist or a Church of Christ, they have to unlearn so many things. But many Catholics are novices or babies when it comes to understanding spiritual truth. And when you explain the Bible to them and you show them what they say about the Sabbath in their own catechism, they accept that, and they become very strong Seventh-day Adventists. So I'm not criticizing Adventists, but I'm just saying they're using this thing of the Virgin Mary. And you've probably heard over the years there have been many apparitions of the Virgin Mary that have appeared in different places. And people go to these pilgrim sites to worship the Virgin Mary. Well, these apparitions have also appeared in the Middle East over Muslim mosques. I have a photo of one that was taken of this apparition over a Muslim mosque that's like 10 stories tall, of the Virgin Mary hovering over a Muslim mosque. And here's the interesting connection between Catholics and Muslims. You've all heard of the apparitions of Mary in Fatima, Portugal. Well, the Prophet Muhammad's daughter was named Fatima. And in the Muslim religion, the Virgin Mary is the second most honored woman behind the Prophet's daughter, Fatima. So the Muslims venerate Mary. So how clever for this apparition, which the devil created, to appear over a Muslim village in Portugal named after the prophet's daughter. Very clever, isn't it? So that's the connection between how the Muslims would be tied in with the Catholic Church, but now how is God reaching the Muslims with the genuine Christian faith? It's largely through visions. I'll tell you what my Bible worker told me. But going back to Bible times, you remember visions were very prominent in Persia, which is modern-day Iran, and also Babylon, which we know today as Iraq. God gave heathen kings like Nebuchadnezzar a dream, a vision, and that's how, because the ancients believed that God, the gods spoke to them through visions. And so that's something that's very prominent in their cultures. And so my Bible worker told me a story that in one particular village, in one night, God gave everybody in that village the same dream about Jesus in a white robe, and how this being told them that he loved them and he had a plan for their life, and that they should go to talk to people that had this black book. In fact, even the Quran says, go to the people of the book. That means Christians, and they will tell you what you need to know. So they had these visions, and the next morning people were talking to each other, and they'd say, hey, you never believed what I dreamed last night. I saw this being in my dream, and he told me to go to the people of the book. And then as they'd share that, the other person would say, well, I had the same dream. And over again, same thing happened. And one night, and just a few days afterwards, because of that dream, that entire village became Christian. Just amazing, how God is reaching out to all people of different backgrounds. God loves them, like I say, too, and sure, there are some radical Muslims, and there's also radical Christians, and every group has their bad apples. So let's not denigrate every Muslim. God loves them, too, and God is, in fact, one of the guys that teaches at the seminary, he's written a lot of books. I'm trying to think of his name. He's going to be a speaker at our camp meeting. Just slips my mind right now. He grew up as a Muslim in Iraq, too. He's a seminary professor. Why can't I think of his name? He does a lot of books on worship and church growth. Oh, Joseph Kidder, that's his name, Joseph Kidder. If you ever get a chance to get his books at the ABC, he grew up as a Muslim, very strong Muslim. He has quite an interesting story to tell, how when he tried to convert to Christianity, he was ostracized by his family and almost killed. But now he's a Seventh-day Adventist seminary professor. So God is reaching out to Muslims. Amen? Brother, you had a question, or did I answer that? Oh, did you? With
Yeah,
Joseph?
he was here.
Was he? Yeah, great. Wonderful. Yeah. So anyway, it's exciting, as the hymn says, I think it's number 617, we are dwelling in a grand and awful time. All the Bible prophets wrote about the times in which we're living, and we are seeing what they wrote about being fulfilled before our very eyes. Even though we don't hear a lot about it, we don't read a lot about it, let me just say that attacks on religious liberty are occurring at an alarming and an increasing rate. And many people are suffering for their faith around the world. One of the newsletters that I get is an organization in Southern California called Open Doors, which ministers to persecuted Christians around the world. And then another one is Richard Wurmbrand's, we're talking about his movie, but what's his organization? The Voice of the Martyrs, yes, thank you, I get that newsletter too. And so every once in a while you read about Adventists that are being persecuted by their faith. I met Richard Wurmbrand in San Jose a few years ago and talked to him and his wife, Sabrina, who was jailed in Romania for over 20 years for his faith in preaching Christ. And I shared another interesting statistic during potluck, that one lady who wrote a book in Washington, D.C., she deals with an organization that monitors persecution of Christians around the world. Her name is Nina Shea, S-H-E-A. She wrote a book called In the Lion's Den, not talking about Daniel, but how Christians are in the lion's den. She made this interesting statement, listen to this, that in the 21st century, the one we're in now, more believers, not just Christians, Muslims, many people don't realize that in, where is it? I think it's in Burma, Rohingya Muslims. If you go on the internet and look that up, Rohingya Muslims. They are being persecuted by Buddhists. They're being killed by Buddhists. So, and in other countries, Buddhists are being killed by Muslims, and in other countries, Christians are being killed by Muslims, and Muslims are, so here's a statement. In the 21st century, more believers have lost their lives than in the previous 20 centuries combined. That's an amazing statement. When you look at the Dark Ages, you look at all those Christians who lost their lives in the first couple of centuries after Christ. And I think her statement even is limited to just the Christians. I think she says more Christians have lost their lives in the 21st century than in all the previous centuries combined. We here in America are so isolated from what's going on and insulated from what's going on in other parts of the world. But we need to pray for our brothers and sisters. Paul says in Hebrews, as one who's in bonds with them. And so it's an exciting time to be alive, and I encourage you to use these resources that I made available to you earlier, and to go on the Church State website, www.churchstate.org, or go to the California website, wwca.gov, and get informed and communicate your wishes to your legislators. If we don't speak up, who will? You remember, I'll close with this, there was a Lutheran pastor, I always get the two names, you can help me, either Reinhold Niebuhr or Dietrich Bonhoeffer. One of those was imprisoned, and he made this statement. He said, when they came for the gypsies, I did not speak up because I was not a gypsy. When they came for the handicapped, I didn't speak for them because I was not handicapped. When they came for the Jews, I didn't speak up because I was not one of them. And then they came for me, and it was too late. Something like that. There was no one left to speak for me. Exactly right. So now's the time when we need to speak up, not for just our own rights, but for the rights of others. Because that's one of the nice things that our church does, and especially Alan Reinick and Dennis Seaton in our Sacramento office, is they have formed relationships with many other organizations. And we've even had the homosexual lobby join us on a couple of bills that we needed support on. It's kind of interesting, not that we support everything that they stand for, but we're developing relationships. As one who has done lobbying a lot of my life, when I go meet with the legislature, Adventist lobbyists, we're not full paid like these high-powered salesmen. I didn't get paid for doing lobby. I just did this as an interested citizen and as a pastor. They go in with a high-pressure tactic that force people to buy what they want them to vote for. I would always take a personal interest in the legislators and their staff, and I'd want to spend some time in small talk and getting to know them and to pray with them. I've had opportunities to pray with many staffers and people in Sacramento. Give you a quick example, just how God orchestrates this. I mentioned St. Lucy's Church that I preached the Good Friday sermon in. Well, at one of the meetings, Sister Lucy played a CD for our lunch music by a nun in Seattle. She wrote these Christian songs, and the father of this nun was a director of the Seattle Symphony, and he composed the orchestral music behind her words. And it was very, very beautiful. And I asked Sister Rosalie if I could get a copy of that music. It was almost like classical music. It was very beautiful. And so what was interesting, this CD was dedicated to a Catholic saint called St. Teresa, not Mother Teresa, but a St. Teresa that lived a couple hundred years ago. So when I went to visit with Liz Figueroa, a Hispanic assemblyman at the time, she was from San Jose, so she was one of my local assembly persons. I went and talked to her on some religious bills that we were lobbying on. And we just had some small talk, and she asked me because she saw that I had my name tag of pastor. She says, what religion? I said, Seventh-day Adventist. And so I asked her, well, what religion are you? And she says, I'm a Catholic. And then we were talking about family, and she says, well, my daughter's getting married this summer. And I don't know why she brought this up, but it was just a God thing. The wind is just closing doors, I guess. But it's not the spirits, I'll tell you that. So she volunteered, and she said, my daughter, her patron saint for her wedding is St. Teresa. My ears picked up, and I said, you won't believe this. she knew I was an Adventist pastor. She said I was at an interfaith clergy meeting just a few weeks ago, and Sister Rosalie gave me a CD dedicated to St. Teresa. I said, would you like to have a tape of that? And she was going to use that for her daughter's wedding. So immediately we just bonded and connected. Here's a Protestant minister that has a tape that's dedicated to her daughter's patron saint for her wedding. I mean, nobody but God could connect all the dots like that. It's just amazing. So just reach out. You know, it's amazing to see what God will do if you just make yourself available. Interact with people. You don't have to be a scholar. You don't have to be a preacher. Just be friends. Be neighborly. Get to know your neighbors. God has opened so many doors because I just go around and I talk to my neighbors. When they go on vacation, I mow their lawns. I water their yard. I take care of their pets, and they do the same for me. And it opens up doors for spiritual conversation. So get involved, be friendly, and let the love of Jesus just shine through you. What do you say? Well, thank you. I don't want to keep you any longer, but it's been a pleasure to be here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you.
Wait a second. We want to pray for our brother, right?
Yeah, thank you.
And also, we have our Josephs and Daniels in Washington, D.C. We have
Yes,
Barry Black,
yes, we do.
Whitley Phipps, and Ben Carson.
Right.
And it's incredible the influence that those three individuals can have.
Amen.
Plus, Trump's son-in-law is an avid Sabbath keeper.
Amen.
So he's going to have a hard time supporting Sunday laws if they threaten to kill his daughter, because she's a Sabbath keeper too.
Yeah, excellent.
Let's pray. Abba, Father, it's so wonderful to have fellowship on the Sabbath with you, with our new and precious brother, Pastor Gary. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for bringing him here, for the Pacific Union, dedicating this Sabbath and sending these men and women around the conferences to promote your will and your blessing through Religious Liberty Ministry. Be with each one of us. May our lives shine brighter and brighter because we gathered in Jesus' name today, and because you've come down to fill us with your glory so that we can give you glory. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Paul, just before you leave, I don't know which mic is on. I guess I just use one. Okay, you can turn that on. I want to say that when I called your pastor on the phone and talked to him, I mean, I just felt a bond with him just after the first few minutes of talking to him. And then when I called him last night about a couple of things, and I met him this morning, I just feel like you're a brother in Christ. Let me give you a hug. Your pastor is just such a friendly guy. You guys are really blessed to have somebody that loves people and loves God too. But, you know, he just makes everybody around him feel so comfortable and relaxed. You people are really blessed. Thank you for the opportunity to get acquainted with my brother Paul here. May God bless your ministry too. Thank you.
Amen. You know, if you have, well, I turned it all off. Well, no, if you have time, spend a few minutes in prayer if you have time. If you don't, if you need to go, we understand that. This has been a beautiful 2 hours. It doesn't feel like 2 hours because the Lord has blessed us with these nice, soft pew cushions. Anyway, if you can pray for those three men, Barry Black, Whitley Phipps, and Ben Carson. They're rubbing shoulders with those people all the time. And pray for each other. Pray for Gary, because he's involved. He's still lobbying. He's still doing things. And may the anointing be with him. God bless you as you pray.
Yes, he is.